Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is the Virtual Research Center for Performance Practices at University of Huddersfield. We are a research center that focuses on performance practice across theater and music and dance. We have a special emphasis on practice research, and this is our rebooted Lines of Flight seminar series, which brings very special guests from near and from far to present and help us think about performance and performance practice and practice research. You can find out, of course, more about the center on our website. Before I talk about tonight's event, I would like to just also mention that our next Lines of Flight research seminar is going to be on the 31st of March, also a Wednesday, also at 6 p.m. And that will be our own Dr. Nick Taylor presenting a talk called Hiding the Elephant in the Room on performance magic and practice research. We very warmly invite you to please join us for that as well. Now, I'll begin to introduce our guest, who I am really excited to have here today. This is Dr. Samuel Ravengai from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he is an associate professor and head of Department of Theater and Performance. A few biographical notes. He holds a PhD and MA in Theater and Performance from University of Cape Town. He's particularly interested in the interconnection of race, nation, empire, migration, and ethnicity with cultural production. His most recent publications are in Sounds of Life, Critical Arts, South African Theater Journal, and he's currently involved in the research project called Afroscenology, which seeks to propound and document a theory on African and diasporic aesthetics based on practice across several years, and a book collection co-edited with Owen Seda called Theater from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe is in production with Palgrave. I want to mention, beyond those formal biographical notes, that I was particularly excited to bring Dr. Ravengai here. We haven't met before. This is the first time that we are meeting. But I came across last year the proceedings from a conference hosted by Arts Research Africa, which has the title, How Does Artistic Research Decolonize Knowledge and Practice in Africa? And this is, I think, one of the most, from my perspective, one of the most important volumes on artistic research that's come out in recent years. I strongly recommend it to you, and it's available completely open access from the University of Witwatersrand repository. Within that volume, Dr. Ravengai has a really crucial contribution, which of course I can't attempt to summarize, but it looks at the relationship between artistic research and artistic practice, but in relation to logocentrism and also to decolonization, decoloniality. At the end of this document, which looks at a number of different ways that artistic research can be framed and how practice can be related to theory and what the place is of the logos in there, and also how that might relate to, what's the phrase I think I used, it's not exactly audiovisual, but it's something like that. He talks about the de-dramatization, the decentering of the text, and the way that this relates also to auditory and audiovisual materials, which is something that's very important to me, as some of you know. But on the last page, he also turns this into a much broader claim, which is that artistic research has the potential to decolonize the curriculum in Africa. This is, of course, a very important potentiality of artistic research to really deconstruct and potentially decolonize the kind of the whole dominating epistemology of the university. It's something that I think is only beginning to be discussed in the European artistic research circles that I'm aware of. And so I'm really excited to have Dr. Ravengai here today with a talk that's called Practice as Research and the Relationship of the Theoretical Explication to the Practice. With that, I hand it over to you. Thank you so much for coming. You're muted. You're muted. Sorry. And then I muted myself, so I couldn't tell you that you were muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
There you go. Yes, thank you so much.
Wonderful. So thanks, Ben, for your kind words regarding my bio and the kind of research that I've been involved with over a period of time in the past. So I really appreciate your generosity in that regard. So I'm happy that you have read my paper that I presented last year at the ARA conference at the Witwatersrand. So my paper is developed from that, not exactly what you have read, which anybody can engage with after this conversation or at any time. What I'm presenting today is what I've aptly called the nature of practice as research and the relationship of the theoretical explication to the practice. I am going to begin my discussion by referring to my experience in artistic research, which has taught me that it may take any of the following dimensions, and I would like to discuss or share with you 7 of these. Artistic research may involve the accumulation of data that confirms an existing theory. So this is the first pathway into the kind of artistic research one can enter into. And this is the place of workshop theater. I'm not quite sure the term that you prefer in the United Kingdom, probably collaborative theater or something like that, variously called device theater, collaborative theater, or radical theater. In this case, the artist researcher or practitioner researcher may work from an existing archive, and I'm going to refer here to some examples from Africa, such as magnet theater, history plays, which rely on memory sites in the Cape Town, such as District 6 Museum, graveyards, and the Bleak Lloyd archive containing Khoisan stories. Magnet theater selects the material and subjects it to various playmaking processes with the result of a theatrical output at the end. Workshop theater, device theater, collaborative theater may depend on the living archive. For example, a number of comrades who went to the liberation struggle of Zimbabwe in the 1970s, and based on their individual experiences, the artist researcher selects the material. I have in mind here theater companies such as Zambuko Theater, which created frontline theater based on the experiences of war collaborators, those who were collaborating with guerrilla armies against Rhodesian forces who had become students shortly after the war. So another example is the Zimbabwe Foundation of Education with Production, ZIMFEP, war plays, such as Won by Blood, created by demobilized soldiers just after the independence of Zimbabwe on the 18th of April, 1980. It was facilitated by Ngugi wa Miri, who is now late, Kimani Gichao, and it is possible that the artist researcher will follow a pre-existing performance theory in realizing performance. It may also be possible that the artist researcher will propose a new performance, employment, or acting theory. It is not an either or situation, so both old and new theories may inhabit the same performance. And I would like to leave it at there in terms of artistic research, which involves the accumulation of data that confirms an existing theory. So here, the theory already exists, and what the practitioner is saying, is doing is to accumulate that kind of data in order to make work around a theory that already exists. But as with any other performance, the performance has the potential to create new codes that may point to an extension of an existing theory, or actually deviating from that theory and creating something new that emerges out of that. For instance, what began was modernism, and while other scholars or theater practitioners were advancing that theory, they then created what was then a postmodernism, and so on and so on. So you begin from something that exists, it extends it to something else that is new, which takes a new form, such as the examples that I've just given you. Now, related to the affirmation theory, I'm talking about the second one. The practitioner researcher may apply an existing theory to facts or plays and performances and so on. In this approach, the work already exists in written form, such as a play, a musical score, a dance notation, a literal work, or whatever artistic product one would like to do. It is already existing. You do not form any new work at all. What you then do is to choose what already exists. And this type of artistic research has been the norm, particularly in the Western influenced academy, where workshopping, collaboration, or what we do here in Africa does not exist. Although, of course, nowadays, this is the norm as well. But in the past, that used to be the case. You work on a play that already exists, written by Chekhov or Gibson, or whatever the case may be, and apply an already existing theory, for example, realism, or something around the psychotechnique or its Western variations, which would be used to guide the performers in researching and construction of characters. And we do know that of late, a new generation of artist researchers has emerged who seek the death of the playwright, replacing them with the auteur director. So this artist researcher deploys postmodernism as a method of employment where they build a performance text from several sources, and the resultant creative output privileges the body over text, exuding a visual dramaturgy. Examples in my context here in Africa would be, scholar practitioners like Ncedisi Shabang, Mandla Mbotwe, Mark Fleshman, Prince Lamla are some of the examples that come to mind when I talk about that. So let me quickly move to the third way in which artistic research may pan out, which is artistic research may involve the generation of a new theory and its empirical testing. So the nexus between performance practice and performance theory, especially in Africa, necessitates that every innovative practical approach in performance preparation, presentation, and training leads to a theory of performance. South Africa, performance practices are thoroughly under-theorized. Most of you may be familiar with many anti-apartheid plays that toured the United Kingdom in the 80s and early 90s that were producing the kind of work that you don't see anywhere in the world. Examples that do come to mind will be Woza Albert, or plays such as Tsepang, and so on and so on. These are made from material and techniques that you find somewhere here in Africa. The question then becomes, where is the theory of this kind of innovative performance that we see from the examples that I've mentioned? So for me, those kinds of new works are proposing a new theory, and I've called it elsewhere Afroscenology. And I think in my bio that Benjamin was reading to you all, you have an understanding that I have a preoccupation to develop that theory based on the examples that we find here in the Global South. And very soon I'll be sharing that with you. So I have in mind the performance practices of Gibson Kente, who produces what is called the African musical, Mongeni Ngema, Pesimtwa, those examples relating to Woza Albert that I was talking about. And previously I talked about Mark Fleshman, Ncedisi Shabang. All these are creating new work that is unique to this geopolitical space. Where is the theory of that? So I am proposing that an artistic research may involve the generation of a new theory. And my supposition or my assumption is that all theory or most theory comes from practice, and it comes back to guide practice. So if this practice is new, at least in our context, what is the theory that we can extrapolate or propound out of that creative output that we are doing? So the global theory of the actor thus no longer fully explain the developments in Southern Africa. In actor training, then there's an over-reliance on global notions of acting based on prominent Western or Eastern theater innovators or theorists like Konstantin Stanislavski, Anton Chekhov, Stanford Meisner. Today, we find that the decolonial discourses are frustrated with lack of African or Southern African knowledges of performer training. So I shall return to this point much later in the process. Colleagues, let me move on to the fourth pathway through which artistic research can be carried out. The generation of new methods for dealing with problems in the discipline or in practice artistic research has helped us to create a method of research called practice as research. So this method is defined as research that is carried out through or by means of performance using methodologies and specific methods familiar to performance practitioners, where the output is at least in part or if not entirely presented through performance. So I'm happy that we've been able to develop this aspect called practice as research, and many scholars are developing variations of its method, like autoethnography or something that Sean in the field of architecture has written to us about reflection in action, reflection on action. And I know many scholars are developing many kinds of ways that we can use, or many kinds of methods that we can use under the rubric practices research. But I don't have time to discuss all of that because my preoccupation tonight is to talk about the various ways in which artistic research can be carried out. So those are just teasers on how that can happen. So let me go or move on to the fifth one. And I would like to take advantage of research that was recently done, I think in 2005, by Temple Hopfleisch, who used to be stationed at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He adds to what I've mentioned above 3 more approaches to artistic research, which I wish to summarize here. He calls the first artistic research approach a study of the arts. And I think this is quite well known, where you do a play and then based on what was happening in design, in performance, in lighting, in sound, in dance, or any of the artistic permutations that do take place in that context, one then decides to write journal articles or collections or monographs or conference papers, the things that we've been doing for all along. Normally called mainstream research. So that's the fifth one, and I'm sure you're quite familiar, or everybody's quite familiar with that. The second, which is the sixth one, is what Hopfleisch calls the arts research as a study undertaken through or by means of the arts. Here, the process of creative writing, painting, choreography, directing, designing, filmmaking, digital coding, curating, for example, is seen as research. So the artist is making discoveries, or if you like, creating some philosophical thought as they create and make them known to the audience or to the analyst. So the creative output is the research. And I'm going to talk about how that creative output can be theorized or can be documented in order for it to be recognized within a university context much later in the process. And finally, the third approach, which is the seventh one, is arts as the development of new technologies and instruments for use by the artists. This is related to the approach of developing new theories, new techniques and processes that are mentioned above, except that here a tangible scientific product is the outcome. So this may be a new light, new paint, new instrument, for example, of a musical nature. I'm going to refer to a very specific example much later in the process of a colleague within the Wits School of the Arts, Jonathan Crossley, who developed a very complicated guitar, which uses an exoskeleton to play some of the strings. And then after making that instrument, he started to theorize on it, and that became his PhD. But I shall be more specific much later in the process, as I promised. Now, you will discover, colleagues, that those that create work which is not research, and those that create work that is for research purposes do the same thing and have the same output. Now, how do we distinguish creative activity and practice, even if of the highest order, or how does creative practice constitute research? However, creative activity can be distinguished from creative research, even if the output resembles each other. Creative activity becomes research when it has been framed as research. So I'm beginning to talk about how creative activity can be seen as research. Therefore, a framing document should be constructed, and the reviewer uses the framing document to evaluate the creative work. In other words, the artist researcher is helping the reviewer to read their work according to their own criteria. Examples of the questions that review while reading or watching your production or your work may include: how does the theater piece or process relate to the framing? Does the theater piece contribute to current practice? Now, what is the theater maker's personal signature or contribution relative to the context? And here I need to emphasize that quality is not the only criterion, but one of the indices of evaluation. John Whitemore has introduced an interesting concept of framing systems, and he argues that audience members or theater analysts bring the totality of the experiences to watch theater and may experience it according to their horizon of expectation. In order to guide the analyst, the artist researcher should put framing systems in place, and he suggests some of the following. Number one, artistic framing. This involves a production concept. It inspires other creative processes. Number two, framing involves an element of intellectual involvement, which may take the form of a literary or performance analysis normally covered in a press release. Thirdly, physical framing. This includes digital drawings of the set, models, sketches, costume, pictures, and so on and so on. And then finally, intellectual is social framing. This can be by providing a statement of intent, outlining the problem. The researcher contextualizes the inquiry. So what place does creative critics, board of theory, and the researcher's own previous work? Awareness of other thinkers' work in the same domain is critical. So positioning the researcher's previous work where it exists, repeated style is recommended, and state the niche work occupies the scheme of things. Now here I need to emphasize one thing, that any candidate who is enrolled into a degree program that uses practice as research, they will need to produce this document on the day of the curating or performance of that particular output, which will guide how the examiner will view or analyze that particular work. And I'm going to argue later on in the process that the framing document together with the creative output will constitute 50% of the mark in our particular context. But here, I'm not making a rule about practice as research. I'm simply drawing from examples, and of course, different institutions will dictate how or will dictate the weighting of each of these components that are going to be submitted for examination. Now, I would like to develop this discussion further by talking about documenting research. How do we make it acceptable to the university? In other words, how do we make the research perpetuate itself to eternity by way of documenting it so that it is acceptable to the university for marking or for examination. I think I've already talked about the creative product. I just want to do a panoramic view of what, on how it can be documented. So I want to begin by saying that when artistic research began to be recognized as research within the academy, institutional values demanded that some form of documentation of the research be carried out. A group of practitioner researchers resisted this logocentric demand and argued that performance itself was a form of dissemination and publication of a different kind. This proposal was often vehemently rejected as a discriminatory imposition, since the work is the equivalent of it and was capable of expressing its aims and results in a single exhibition, performance, or whatever method of dissemination. However, institutional values have prevailed, and this position, to my knowledge, has been abandoned by most universities in favor of some kind of documentation of the practice. So the questions to be raised are, what kinds of documentation are acceptable to the academy? What relationship do these have with the creative project or projects? And I try to grapple with these questions as I move towards the end of my paper. What is normally submitted to the examiners for marking usually takes the following forms, which is the creative project or its selected components stored in a retrieval system such as a DVD, online link, a CD-ROM, integral traces of the creative project such as the play, notes, call sheets, costume designs, set designs, journals, treatments, choreographic notation, sound scores, press release, publicity, paratext, photographs, and so on and so on. You can see that I'm beginning to repeat stuff that I've mentioned under the framing document, so this may be placed in that context. Now, these may be included in a framing document that I've discussed above, and some candidates have also submitted performance lectures or lecture performances. For some candidates, there will be a reflexive essay, normally called a thesis at doctoral level or dissertation at lower postgraduate levels. Each of these three components will take different formats depending on the nature of artistic research or the institutional demands. As I mentioned earlier on, at Wits University, 50% of the mark is allocated to the creative project, and the other 50% of the final mark is reserved for the academic essay, which is the thesis. And Peter Hatton, I want to quote him here, uses the epithet or phrase individuated to capture one of the qualities of documentation which pertains to its appropriateness to what it documents. So different kinds of artistic research will be documented in different formats appropriate to what has been preserved in writing. In other words, the content determines the form of documentation. There is not a single way of writing, and I want to engage with the above pathways of research in more detail. So before I talk about the thesis, which is the academic essay, I want to talk about the creative project. Now, as early as the 1940s, theater practitioners like Bertolt Brecht grappled with the idea of documenting research which prefigured contemporary concepts of documentation. For some of his productions, he created what he called model books, which can be loosely translated to English as model books, which contained multitudinous multitudinous photographs of his episodes with detailed captions. The captions were constructed from character dialogue, stage directions, and expanded explanations for future staging of the production. From a random check of these model books, one sees a good attempt at commentary to explain such concepts as gestus, the V-effect, epic theater, and so on and so on. So the creative project that is submitted in contemporary times with the advantage of nonlinear editing as some of these elements. Some practitioner researchers submit a whole DVD, a whole video of the performance to the examiner. Again, according to institutional demands, others view this wholesale submission as devaluing the live performance practice, which in any case would have been seen by the audience and the examiner. So a recording of a performance is not its replica, nor its true representation. To disrupt this notion of duplicability, some practitioner researchers select short edited video excerpts of the production, which may include some recording of the working process. So you can see here, I am providing various dimensions where, according to institutional demands, a candidate may begin to make choices as to which components of the creative project will be submitted to the examiner. Now, with the advent of digital editing, some practitioner scholars have explored further with the video, choosing to incorporate more elements of the model book into the video, the model book that I've just talked about, which was first begun by Bertolt Brecht. What is recorded as commentary may be taken from the thesis or further interrogation of the practice through text that is unique to the model ebook. In that case, the model ebook is a standalone quality which may be understood without referring to the thesis. At the same time, the researcher may refer to the examiner to any part of the video through a link or a provision of a time code. So the model ebook, I want to call this the model ebook because it's digitized, may contain still pictures of the performance with thick description of the scenes reminiscent of the Brecht model books. If there are any conceptual proposals, the picture offers the best opportunity to explain such theoretical tenets. Other scholars keep the video recording and the model ebook as separate submissions, while some combine both in one submission. Again, I am allowing choices to take place here. Again, the nature of the project and institutional demands will determine which route or pathway to be followed in this regard. Having said this, I now want to move to the thesis, which is the reflexive essay. The other pathway to research in the thesis. Based on my supervision of the thesis and of course examination of the same, I've noticed a few issues that are handled by researchers in the same way. Almost all of them have an introduction that handles matters normally covered in a proposal, such as aims and objectives of the research, methods, which is normally practices research, theories and research questions. Now, after the introductory matters, the study then tends to, excuse me as I take my water. The study tends to contextualization of the subject matter. A colleague in our school of the arts, Jonathan Crossley, made a special guitar, I think I've referred to him on top, and then carried out a study of the technologically enabled performance. He contextualized the study by describing his entry into music, including people who inspired him, especially in making music through improvisation. The contextualization dealt with non-literature on the making of instruments, and then some deep engagement with improvisation as a way of making music. Another study by Janis Balodis documented the process of adaptation from novels to play text. Balodis had been doing this for a while and then decided to turn the practice into research. Contextualization involved reasons for adaptation and a deep engagement with literature on the subject of adaptation, including comparisons of different kinds of adaptation. Looking at the various kinds of research, it seems to me every subject cannot be carried out without a cumulative analysis of what has taken place in the area of study. Contextualization involves a deep engagement with the arguments, with issues, with ideas that have been carried out by others in order to point to the examiner the niche one is studying, which is the novelty of the new work that the person is creating. From this point in the research, the thesis takes different kinds of relationships to the creative practice, depending on the nature of the investigation. At WITS, for example, the doctoral program in creative writing only considered candidates who have already established themselves through a body of published creative works such as novels, plays, biographies, short stories, or a collection of essays. At this stage, there is no requirement to generate another literary work during the course of the degree program. The doctoral candidate is required to engage with a history of ideas in relation to the texts they have produced in the past. It would be an investigation of the traditions in the novel into which they are writing. So to distinguish themselves from literature students, they discourage them from undertaking any literal analysis of their work. The thesis would be a treatise on the subject of writing fiction in a specific context. So the writing is characterized by hypermedia framings on philosophical underpinnings of the project. For example, I'm going to refer to my own work at UCT in 2001 when I did my master's. My master's research was on the subject of theater making from a playwriting perspective. My creative project involved writing a play and its direction and staging in Cape Town. The academic essay then engaged with a survey of various kinds of playwriting in Zimbabwe and the theoretical underpinnings inspiring such work. The study then took a critical survey of socialist realism and realism, which of course inspired the work that I was trying to critique, and their limitations in projecting the reality of Zimbabwe at that particular time. The study then proposed a different way of playwriting exemplified by my creative project centered around decolonizing writing by foregrounding syncretism. The study then engaged with both the written play and the performance justifying the choices I made. While there is engagement with the process, its description is not the main thing, but a means to an end. Now, if a thesis were to engage with purely cataloging the process, this is how I did it. It would be potentially boring. If the process is proposing a new theory, then the practitioner researcher could engage with the tenets of this new theory and testing it through referring to the practice. If the practice is referring to an existing theory, it could be prudent to describe the process by applying that theory and exemplifying it. Take Janis Balodis, I referred to earlier on, whom he had a deep engagement with the process of adaptation, beginning from reading the novel, finding the story and conflict, scenario building, drafting of the first manuscript, and working on feedback. All this is undertaken by deploying the mechanics of narrative theory involving order, duration, frequency, and point of view, a model propounded by Sam Smiley. As I move towards the conclusion of this discussion, I would like to reiterate or recap a few issues about the relationship between the creative practice and the thesis or the reflexive writing. It may be an elucidation in the scholarly dissertation of a theoretical or philosophical questions raised by the creative project, or it may be an alternative approach to the themes of the creative project. For example, where the creative project may be a play or a dance, the dissertation may be an historical analysis, or it can be a discussion of the literal, political, or philosophical context that gives rise to the creative project. A discussion and analysis of literal genre, methodology, forms in works similar to or from the same genre as the creative project. As I come to the end of my discussion, I would like to read to you a quotation offered by the trio of Ledger, Fiona, and Simon, relating to the documentation of practice. And this is how the quotation goes. However, while documentation is part of a set of practices necessarily enfolded from the onset in creative research projects, the form of a final submission is often a particular negotiation between institutional demands, practitioners' resistances to the established expectations, and artistic scholarly imperatives. Colleagues who are with me virtually, this is where I would like to end, and I thank you, Ben. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to ask a question, and then I'll open it up to everyone with I'm sure that others have questions and things they'd like to ask and discuss. So thank you so much for that wonderful talk. It's a very kind of almost panoramic view of the possibilities. I wanted to ask you about kind of the current status, but also future possibilities. I mean, I'm still thinking about this part at the end of that piece that I was reading from before, where you talk about decolonization and you talk about kind of armed struggle as the first phase of decolonization, which is something that that is being discussed a lot these days about what is decolonization or decoloniality in the context, especially in the context of the university. Like, what does it actually concretely look like? And I'm really excited about that link that you've made to artistic research. So my question has two sides, I think. The first side is just I'd like to, I mean, what you were just discussing was so clear in terms of current status of what's possible, and particularly this contested point of the form of the doctoral thesis and what it can look like. But where would you like to see that go, or where would that go? Like, what are the steps that are kind of either the roadblocks currently, like things that are preventing it? You mentioned, for example, also in this paper, I think you said that no one has been promoted in South Africa at a staff level, a faculty level, on artistic research. So presumably that's a major concern. So where are the other kind of, I guess, where are the key like tension points or the areas where it could be advanced? But the other side of the question is, on the other side of the kind of the pragmatics of the moment, and what are the key points of contestation right now, I would love to know what you see as like the most radical vision of artistic research, right? You talk about challenging the dictatorship of the logos, and you talked about all these different ways of doing documentation. What would it look like if there were, for example, if one of the student-led decolonization movements were to foreground artistic research, or if someone were setting up a new university and they were saying, yes, let's put artistic research, let's really do artistic research, like let's go all the way with artistic research to this point of decolonizing the curriculum. What would that look like? What would that be like in terms of the PhD thesis and the way teaching is done and everything? So kind of two sides, like the pragmatics at the moment, but also what's the boldest vision?
Well, thank you, Ben. It keeps me quite thinking. So first of all, I will address a question about problems within the academy that's preventing the recognition of artistic research. So first of all, I think the university, the academy, was founded on the Oxcam formula, Oxford-Cambridge formula, particularly in our geopolitical space here in the global south. And in that regard, what has been worshipped has been research that is written on paper, that is peer-reviewed. And when this notion of artistic research was introduced, the Senate, which is the supreme body that runs the affairs of the university, is obviously populated by people who do not come from our field. In most universities that don't have as many artistic disciplines as, for instance, it could be music department or theater, and all other disciplines of an artistic nature are not there. The voices are not heard. It's probably one chairperson against a multitude of other people who come from social sciences or science or whatever the case may be, that their voices get drowned in that space where they're supposed to discuss policy, and everything falls apart. I have, for instance, the example in Zimbabwe, where the theater department is the only artistic department within the whole university. So when the whole university is calling for regulations around how a degree program is to be constructed, what percentage goes to practice, what percentage goes to, and so on and so on, the persons sitting around the table are so few to support these kinds of endeavors that are there. And you are right to point to a promotions document that I mentioned in my previous paper, where even if the policy is there that says that one could be promoted on the basis of what they're doing practically. However, the people who sit around the table to discuss somebody's promotion have no idea of what artistic practice is. They would like to see a piece of paper with a catalog of journal articles, which in that particular case does not exist. And therefore, because we do not have representation at those crucial stages of decision making, we experience a number of problems. However, I don't want to paint a gloomy picture of the situation. I think more and more changes are beginning to happen, with more universities advancing or beginning to take more artistic disciplines in the mainstream, and more lecturers and more voices beginning to accept this kind of research. Prior to 2000, I must say, this would have been heretic to talk about study of this nature. But now most universities are beginning to grapple and to accept the idea that promotion or research can be pursued in these particular ways. So let me go to your last question. What are the most radical ways of conducting artistic research? Well, that's a difficult question, but I will attempt to answer it. Now, I would like a situation that is interdisciplinary. For instance, instead of creating a creative product or creative output and then theorizing on it, I would like a situation where a novelist who is a creative artist may come to view a fine art or visual art product and probably write a novel based on what they've seen in a different discipline. And that becomes the output that is presented as a dissertation or as a thesis. And the same thing can happen, that one can read a novel, and after reading a novel, they get inspired to create work of an artistic nature, such as a play, or visual art, or digital arts, or music, or whatever the case may be, and that becomes their dissertation that they submit for examination. This is not currently happening. So if you're asking me about radical ways, that's the radicalism that I would like to pursue if I were to begin that process from where I'm sitting.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up now to other questions or comments. Let me just say at this point that the meeting is being recorded. So if you want to appear on video, but you don't want to appear in the recording, just get in touch with me later and I can remove you. Or if you'd like to ask a question without appearing on video, you can absolutely post it in the chat and I can ask it from there. Feel free to raise your digital hand or just pop up with your video. There's a question in the chat. Are you talking there about specifically adaptation or is it more inspiration? If I understand that correctly, it's about the point you were just making about a kind of radical interdisciplinarity as a form of research and what form that would take. And I suppose, yeah, I think that's what right? Is it adaptation? Is it inspiration? I guess one of the questions that would arise from that is like, how do you assess the relation?
That's good. It can be both. It can be an inspiration. One comes to view a visual art product and they go write a play about it. One may view, because adaptation has got different colors or different ways in which one can do adaptation. So from one of the dimensions of adaptation, it can be seen as such, but it may also be inspiration. So it could be both ways, so to speak. And I see Alex has written a comment that says, "Lovely to see you. Looking forward to your seminar." Well, there is the seminar, Alex. If you're still there, good to be in touch with you.
Emily, please, yeah.
Thank you so much for a really, really stimulating overview of and as Ben said, panoramic discussion of the lie of the land. I was wondering about your thoughts on other modes of academic dissemination, specifically the conference, which traditionally is somewhere where people talk, stand up and read papers and give PowerPoints. And certainly in my field, in music, it is increasingly common to try and incorporate performance into them, but it's often a very awkward fit because the performer turns up, they might have to spend 2 or 3 days sitting in conference halls with no access to a space where they can practice, where they can prepare physically for what they do, and then they turn up and give a performance in a strange space, in a very strange context, and then there aren't really questions afterwards because they've just given a performance, and it's very odd. It always seems very awkward to me. I was wondering if you had any thoughts of how radical ways to rethink that kind of academic encounter where we come together to share work in progress and give each other feedback that might be more about sharing artistic research through artistic practice, perhaps collaboratively through embodied encounters, just ways to do it better, I think.
Yes, thank you, Emily. You will recall I mentioned in passing the notion of performance lectures, sometimes called lecture performances. And I proposed that it could be, well, in the case of a PhD or a master's by creative research, it could be one of the pathways one may choose to submit their work to the examiner. And I think this is a growing method of documentation of practice. It's done differently by different people, but my understanding is that one will have an audience and they will use multimedia kind of approaches to doing their performance, and they will do the performance and talk and also incorporate audience feedback to that particular lecture. which is then recorded and then archived as a submission to the examiner. Now, as I mentioned, the choices are quite wide. One may choose to do it as is, or they may choose to then incorporate other multimedia elements such as voiceover, number one. Number two, written commentary over and above the lecture performance or performance lecture, and including some still photographs that may be put into that. But these are all the options that one may choose to explore over and above what may be contained in that. So yes, that's quite a plausible way in which one can disseminate and publish that information. Perhaps the question is it enough as a way of documenting practice that can go to the examiner? From my experience, I think in the last few years that I've been an examiner and that I've supervised, it is one of the pathways, but not the only one that can be submitted for examination. And perhaps I can go on to add the fact that none of the pathways is privileged over the other. And in most cases, one pathway is not a prerequisite to understand the other. It must be a standalone kind of engagement. And then the examiner will choose which ones they would like to look at independently, and all three of them, or both, two if they're submitting two, will present a clearer picture of what the research was about. But each of these must be able to stand on its own and speak in its own voice as part of the submissible material for that particular examination.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have a PA and then Mike O'Connor, and then there's a question in the chat that I can read out loud from John.
Thank you very much for this paper and overview. I might have misunderstood, or maybe you didn't talk about it, but it was you covered so much ground that by the time I caught with an idea, you were already the next one. Fascinating. I will need to read, but I'm not sure if you talked about iterative processes and the knowledge making of art versus science. So there's Hellström, who wrote a paper in 2010 talking about evaluation of artistic research, which I found fascinating because he differentiates science as research and art as research as two different ways of devising knowledge, so different episteme system completely. And in art, it is often the case, I found in my practice research, that, and my students, that throughout a PhD, their research question will transform radically, if not emerge from the practice as part of a iterative process. So it is a quite different mode of operating and generating knowledge than science, with a preceding hypothesis, which I maybe misunderstood what you were saying, but in your presentation, it seems that you were talking about hypotheses that were preceding the work in general, except for the literature review approach to a portfolio. But what do you think of these methods that are more maybe iterative and where questions emerge from answers instead of the other way around?
That's an interesting question, Pierre, and I would like to approach it from this perspective. I think the thing that we call practice as research seems to be new to us in the artistic field, but the sciences have been doing this for quite a long time. Although they didn't call it practice as research, they were working in the laboratories, but they were following, like all sciences, positivist approaches. In other words, you have a hypothesis, you guess what is likely to happen, but you don't have scientific proof that that is a point. So the purpose of practice is to affirm or to authenticate your intelligent guess, which is if I mix chemical A, B, and C, this is what I'm going to get. And therefore you get it, then you can pin the description and say, this is what I did. So this is now factual because I've provided that kind of evidence. Now, if I'm hearing you correctly, that is still a possibility in the arts that one may pursue a positivist approach to seeking knowledge, but it is not the only pathway to finding knowledge. And I think scholars have created a term that they call practice-led research. In other words, you approach the laboratory with no research question, with no method, with nothing actually. And when you begin to work in the laboratory, you discover what the question is, you discover what it is that you want to research about, and the proposal is an aftermath of the process of working in the laboratory, as opposed to being a prerequisite for admission into the degree. And I think there are those departments, particularly visual arts, that use that kind of approach, and they call it practice-led. So I don't want to mislead anybody and say there's one pathway of doing, this kind of endeavor. There are different ways, and practice-led being one among several other ways of doing it. I don't know if I'm making sense to you regarding the question that you raised, Pierre.
Definitely, but what then? Because we understand each other on the latter proposal, how would you, in your framework of proposing these book or these kind of cahier de charge, as we say in French, for the examiner, how do you envisage a presentation of such a portfolio, which will be much more organic in terms of its construction over a PhD period of 3, 4, 5 years?
Mm-hmm. So I see here a potential conflict with institutional requirements. Number one, the institution would like a proposal at the beginning of the process, but you are saying, hello, I don't have one. I don't know what I'm researching. I don't know what I'm going to research on, but I have an idea of what I would like to work on within the laboratory. So this is where I think we need to make noise as practitioners, that we do not necessarily need a product at the beginning of a proposal at the beginning of the process. It's something that may emerge as we begin to work from there. And I need to give an example that we have followed at WITS, particularly in what used to be called fine arts, now visual arts. They have adopted that kind of practice. And it was debated at school level, and the head of school went to fight for that principle at faculty level, and it was accepted. So proposal is no longer a requirement in that particular department. They must produce it after the event. I think what cannot be eliminated though, Pierre, is the fact that some kind of documentation needs to happen somewhere along the process or before you graduate. Imaging with nothing becomes problematic within the academy. At least that I don't think we're going to win in the near future. It's going to stay with us for quite a while.
Thank you.
Mike?
Sure. Thanks so much for your easy to understand presentation. I have just a simple question. The 7 categories of creative research you outlined, I can see myself doing like 3 of them. Do you think this is natural in that they blur, or do you think you have a better case if you stick to one and get more secure in arguing that?
It's a brilliant question. Well, in the academy, we normally separate issues for purposes of analysis, but the fact of the matter is we work at the intersection of concepts. So it is one or a creative combination of any of the 7, what works for you. So don't feel obliged to choose one and say, well, that guy from it said you choose at least one. It's any creative combination of any of the options that are available, including all, if that's okay.
There's a question in the chat, which I think relates to PA's question, but I'll read it out loud because maybe it's a little bit more micro level. John Cruz says, thank you for your comprehensive reflection, Samuel, really useful and inspiring. I have a question about the different modes in the practice, research, reflection cycle. Do you have any tips about how to capture these shifting modes while actually making creative work, as opposed to a retrospective reflection? I get so distracted by the security of reading when I know I should be in the emerging practice of making art. What I get from that is similar to PA's question in a way that it's certainly about the iteration that happens inside of art making. Really well said there. This is really, I mean, this also connects to one of my central research questions about how to capture these shifting modes in the cycle. Yeah, thinking about that maybe on a practical.
Yes, you remember I offered a disclaimer and said that we use the term practice as research in order to encompass quite a number of methods that we can use. And if I'm reading that question correctly, it is asking me, do we reflect after the moment, in the moment? And I would like to refer the person who proposed the question to an architecture scholar called Don Scone. I think he wrote his book in 1998. It's called Educating the Reflexive Practitioner, the reflective practitioner. We do the same thing. They draw, we perform in theater and performance, but the method that he is proposing will work for all of us. So he's got something that he calls reflection on action, which is after the event. And he has a term that he calls reflecting in action. While you are in the act of doing, you are processing what is happening. And I think in theater, we use this thing called start, stop, start, stop, start, stop. You start the process, you stop it, you stop. In fact, we work through repetition. So as you repeat the material, you start, stop it, you start, stop it. You are exercising what he calls reflecting in action and then jotting out the things that you would like to discover. I think he's got more to offer than what I can summarize in these short minutes that I have. But I'd like to refer you to that particular scholar, Don Scone, Educating the Reflective Practitioner. Ben, did you read me?
Yes. I was just looking to see if there were any other hands. Are there any other comments? Any other comments or questions that people would like to make? Emily, yeah?
I can go again. I can go all night. I was listening to you talking. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how you guide students on this process, postgraduate students, and particularly one of the challenges I find when supervising is particularly the way that the institution tends to impose a particular model of research on the student, on their documentation. So for instance, our students have to submit a proposal structured by research questions at the start of their project. And as we were discussing, the iterative nature of practice and the way that you often start from nothing makes that very hard for them. And I particularly tend to find the notion of research questions can become a real mental block for some practice-based students. So I was wondering how you deal with that, how you kind of turn around that concept and help them past
it. From experience, all right. I'm trying to think of specific examples that I've dealt with. I had a student who was trained in tap dance. And then she discovered that what we call in South Africa, Pantsula dance, has got elements of tap dance. And then she decided to combine tap dance and pansula to create what she called tapsula. And she called this a decolonization phase. Now, there were difficulties, a number of difficulties in terms of phrasing questions. She produced a very brilliant piece, but how do you turn that into research? How do you ask questions? And so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. So my challenge to her in the process was, you are not the first person who has done mixing of dances. Go read journals, go read books, and where I could cite specific examples, I would ask her to go and do that. And she was a very slow learner, and I would ask her, read a chapter, summarize it in one page, read a chapter, summarize it in one page. And as we were doing that, she was beginning to see the different voices articulating on the same subject, but from different perspectives. And she was beginning to see problems and gaps and gray areas from that. And from that interface and deep engagement with various people who had done slightly different things in the same field, the research questions began to emerge. So I have found it very helpful for myself and my students, I don't know about you, that when you ask them to read around stuff, new questions, new positions, gray areas begin to emerge, and they phrase their questions better than if they know nothing, and the only thing that they know is about their work that they're doing in the laboratory. It becomes really a struggle to make something out of just that little that they know from the laboratory. I'm sharing my experience. It works for me. I don't know about others. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me ask another question. I'm going to go back to this question about the relationship between artistic research and decolonization, just because it's very much on my mind, but you did just mention it again. The people who are, so this is, I'm thinking from outside our field now, the people who are thinking about decolonization in a more general sense, and I'm thinking like students involved in Rhodes Must Fall and people who are also just writing about decolonization of knowledge and curriculum change and things like that. Do you, in your perception, I guess basically in South Africa and other places that you're aware of, do they see a place for what we understand as artistic research in that movement? And if so, is that another kind of avenue for alliance? And is that another kind of alternative way to put pressure on the university rather than just coming from within our discipline, and saying, well, this also counts as knowledge? Is there another kind of way to arrive from these more politicized calls? But I'm also wondering, in some cases, do they not really see what we understand as artistic research and what we might understand as like a radical epistemological revolution as necessarily related to the movement? And if that's the case, then again, I'm wondering, if our vision of artistic research is radical enough.
That's a very interesting question. So first of all, our practice, and I'm going to refer to theater and performance, which is where I understand things much clearer. We've been teaching in the academy realism for many years, and using Konstantin Stanislavski's methods of the former actor training, or its variations like Miesner and so on and so on. Now, when you begin to create work that has got a center in Africa and in South Africa, that is done in different ways from the rest of the world, from what the rest of the world does. It is proposing a new ways of doing things. And as I argued previously, since all or most theory comes from practice, there is theory that may be derived from that. So in many ways, scholars are beginning to grapple, scholars from this side of the world are beginning to grapple with what is the theory that we are gaining from these kinds of practices. So to me, that is intense in terms of pursuing the agenda of decolonization. That number one, you do not always do Shakespeare, with all due respect to Shakespeare, Chekhov and all Western plays. You begin to do plays that you have generated from your context, Africa. Number two, you begin to create actor or performer training methods that do not always derive from Stanislavski or Chekhov, or whatever the case may be. And I want to draw from a prominent scholar called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that in our practices in the global south, the center is in the north. When we want to perceive or know what is beautiful, we go north. When we want to know what does the color red or blue or yellow mean, we go north for everything in terms of meaning, perception, epistemology, and so on and so on. However, Ngugi wa Thiong'o proposes, and I think he's written a book called Moving the Center. You move the center from the north, coming to the south. So material generated from the south or epistemes that are generated from the global south will pursue that kind of decolonization. That's on one level. On the second level, the academy, which I framed as being derived from the Oxcam example, Oxford, Cambridge University example, worships the word. And you will understand that in the global south, the inscription or the preservation of knowledge was embodied in the body through the songs, the dances, the griots, the Izimbongo praise poets who sing praises to the ancestors until the last one, and so on and so on. That's how you preserve knowledge. It's all oral. Now, that through the education system that we were exposed to by way of colonization was sidelined as useless knowledge. But that begins to be foregrounded in the manner in which we create work as knowledge that is acceptable, and that deviates from the logos or the worship of logocentrism and so on and so on. So on that dimension, again, we pursue the notion of decolonization. But decolonization also is a third dimension, which is gender-related issues. They're also fitting into that kind of program. But I'm not well qualified to talk about that. But when people refer to decolonization, they also bring on those kinds of dimensions. Not quite sure if that addresses the concern that you raised right from the beginning, Ben.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. I mean, I'm still wondering if you have a perception of, from the outside of our discipline, if the people who are kind of more generally thinking about decolonization, if they're aware of this particular battle, or if those conversations are happening, like between people in theater and performance studies and people who are looking to decolonize the university, just kind of in general, are conversations happening or not?
Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes.
Thank you so much. Misha had a question, which I think just goes back to the previous question about the Tapsula performance. I guess also about the iteration question. Did the student produce the performance and later wrote about it, or other way around, or was it iterative? How did the process go in terms of that performance and the writing?
Yes, she was a mature entry student, no academic background whatsoever, but a fantastic performer, theater maker. So she made this work sometime in 2004. It made headlines. I think she won a number of awards in South Africa in the theater circles and so on. And then she used the awards and the consecration credentials that she achieved as a way of moving into the academy, to say, look, I've got these skills. Can I enter the honors program? Yes. After passing the honors programs, can I do the master's program? So yes, the work was done before entering the university. And I think it's reminiscent of the other example that I gave you, which is the doctoral program in creative writing, where entrance into that program is purely by having a portfolio of work that you've done before. And when you come into the academy, you are not expected to generate another creative project. You simply reflect on what you've been doing in the past. So yes, this happened before she came into the academy. And then she used that as a platform to write about it.
That's helpful. Let's take one more question or comment. Ivona had something to say, and then we'll finish up.
Hello. Thank you for the interesting lecture. It helps a lot. However, I have a question. From your experience, because you mentioned about a kind of a research that arises from inspiration and then results in a variety, which might result in a variety of outcomes. Would you like to give some examples? And I'm especially interested in dance. So if you have any examples of how this inspiration-led process may be conducted in a way, it would be very helpful. Thank you.
Right. I'm trying to think of specific examples. What I do have concretely is people who love to read novels. And then they think that this particular story in a novel will do wonders if I use it in a different context, such as theater. And I think I have one of the examples that I mentioned is called Janice Barros from Australia. The kind of theatrical output that emerges out of that would qualify as inspiration, in the sense that there is no faithful reproduction of the novel into theater. It is one of the components in a novel, just maybe a character or two or three, that inspire the playwright in order to develop something new that may be remotely or sometimes not even related to the novel that he had read. I'm trying to remember the technical term for that. I think they call that synchronic transformation, if I'm correct. Synchronic transformation, which is no relationship with the source material. It becomes something new. So that's the very specific example that comes to my mind as you asked me that question. I'm also aware that when somebody visits a laboratory or a museum and they see an art, or a gallery and they see an artwork, people perceive the artwork in different ways. Someone may see a story in the artwork, and then they begin to write a novel or a play based on an artwork that they've seen. I remember when I was doing the playwriting program at UCT, we call that beginning from an image. You see one image, just one image, and it inspires you to write something that is voluminous based on that particular thing. I'm also aware of historical fiction, where one goes to the history department, reads a historical story located in a different discipline, and based on history, I am going to mention something that I've seen I think it was a politician who loved Africans. I'm trying to remember a name because I saw that play a long time ago. It must have been 2000 in Cape Town, and the play was called African Champion. Okay, so they simply selectively chosen moments when this politician engaged with Africans and created a story out of the history that they've done. I'm not quite sure if that addresses some of the aspects of the question that you asked, Iwana.
Yeah, it explains a lot. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for this really rich presentation and all of these perspectives that you brought us and all of these answers. Thanks to everyone for joining and listening and raising these wonderful questions and participating in the conversation. I think we're going to finish here, and we hope to see you in a couple of weeks for our next Lines of Flight presentation.
Colleagues watching me online, thank you so much. And Ben, thank you for inviting me and for offering me this opportunity to speak to a wider audience than my African audience. Thank you. Good night.
Yeah, good night.
Cheers.